So good morning and welcome. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this morning. Many of you are very familiar faces. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Our business research series is about the practical application of research. At Olin, we strive to produce research that is world-changing. It is our vision to produce research that is world-changing, has world impact. And part of that impact is sharing some of the important research that's done here with the business community. Faculty submit papers annually for consideration for our Olin Award, and that's reviewed by a panel of highly distinguished and highly experienced judges from all sectors of the business community. And the best research is chosen for presentation at Business Research Series presentations and on our webpage. And Dick Mahoney, distinguished executive in residence and former CEO of Monsanto, has benefited the school tremendously from his vision and his gifts in pushing forward this program and really making the application of research to practice foremost in the school's mission. So, Dick, I'd like to thank you very much for that vision and for your continued support of the school. So today we're going to hear from Lamar Pierce. Lamar is a great asset to the school. In fact, he's struggled out of a sick bed to be here this morning. That's why he's sitting in isolation. Splendid isolation. So, being ill is not sufficient excuse not to turn up. I'm glad to see his dedication. Lamar's been part of the Olin faculty for about 10 years now, back since 2007, and before that was a Harrington faculty fellow at the University of Texas at Austin. And I understand he grew up in a small town on the border of Washington and Idaho. Studied economics, mathematics and music at the University of Puget Sound before working as an industrial engineer for Boeing for a spell, and then did his PhD at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. His research focuses on economic and psychological factors that impact productivity and misconduct. So I'm quoting here, he's fundamentally interested in why employees, I'm interested as well, why employees act in ways we know to be destructive to the organisations and individuals around us, and what environmental, social and financial factors bring us back into the fold of productive behaviour. So, Lamar, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank Dick Mahoney for his support of the school. This has been sort of a great program for our school over the years, and you know, even though I didn't win this year, I still respect it. Yeah, so ironically, I'm super sick today.
Nice things you might win.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the irony is, of course, I'm very sick today, so I'm sorry I wasn't out there talking with you, but I don't think you would have wanted that. Emery has generously, she doesn't know this yet, but she generously agreed to continue if I fall over. So she'll do that. But yeah, it's great to be here and get a chance to present this work for you, because we're really quite excited about it. And now I got to see if I can figure this out. So I have to tell you, I am, much like many of our politicians today, a victim of the mainstream media. In fact, this is an article that the Wall Street Journal wrote about our paper 4 weeks ago. And when it came up and was posted, we looked at the headline and were deeply distressed, because the headline here says, "Healthier workers are more productive," study finds. You might look at this headline, you might go, duh, right? Like, this is not a big breakthrough, and you know, this tends to bring out the trolls on the internet. In fact, some of the reader comments. If you ever if you're an academic and you ever get an article written about your research, don't look at the comments. This is my favorite one. Very true. You know, this is part of the problem with the headline, right? And the author has since apologized for this. But you know, some other great ones, correlation, not causation, which is actually not true either. And of course, the obvious one. So you know, we obviously got a lot of feedback to this, but part of the problem, of course, is this misses the entire point of what this paper's about. and what this research is about, which is this isn't about the fact that healthier people are more productive. I think we know that this is probably the case. We don't know exactly when and sort of what the different magnitudes are or what the key conditions are that drive productivity. But we know that being healthy in general makes one more productive. So you can think of like this presentation as a lower bound on my presentation skills. What this paper is really about is about whether or not firms can do anything around this. So what we don't know is we don't know whether or not all the money that firms spend on trying to make their employees healthier actually makes them more productive. And this is a pretty big and important open question for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not obvious. So there are a lot of open questions here. So one of the big open questions here is if you implement this and you try to get workers to get healthier, are they actually going to do it? Are they actually going to get healthier? We certainly don't believe that workers are marionettes, that we can say, okay, get healthier, and they're going to necessarily do it. Particularly because personal health is it's a very personal domain. And because of all the legal limitations around what you can do around health, all the HIPAA laws, and I'll talk a little bit about that afterwards. But second of all, even if they do get healthier, does this translate into productivity? And more importantly, when and how much? Because ultimately what we care about is the ROI on this. We might also, from a social responsibility standpoint, care about treating our employees better. But in publicly owned firms, that often gets pushed to the side based on shareholder pressure. Third, the question might be which improvements are most important. So, what should you focus on? Should you focus on, say, toe fungus, or should you focus on diabetes? Now, we don't have toe fungus in our data here, but this is a question, because you have a limited number of resources in these programs. What are you going to focus on? Are you going to focus on issues of obesity and diabetes? Are you going to focus on mental health? And I'll talk about that a little bit. But which of these are really the most important issues? Again, number 4 is this issue of ROI, which is, these things cost money. And the question is, how much do you get back? And this is really like the important bottom line question, the big policy issue, is, what do you get out of this? And these things are often very, very difficult to translate and calculate. And I'll talk about that in a sec. But finally, the psychological issues here. How do you do this in a way that your workers don't get pissed off? Because again, if I'm a worker and Dean Taylor comes here and says, Lamar, you're looking like you aren't fitting into your suits this morning, which is actually true. I had to try putting on another suit. If he comes in and does this, I might react very, very poorly to that. We know that employees don't like people stepping in and trying to pull away their autonomy, particularly on very personal issues. So how do you do this in the right way? And these are all really complicated and open questions. It's an important question, particularly because we know all about sort of the health trends that are happening in the United States. So if you look sort of at the general population, about 35% of US adults are technically obese. So this is a rising problem. And this doesn't mean that all obese people have health problems, but certainly we know there are a lot of problems that are correlated with it. So this seems to be a rising issue, both here in the United States. If you think about other major growing growing economies like India and China, it's an even bigger escalating problem at this point. So this is one really important thing. If you look at diagnosed type 2 diabetes and the scale of how this is expanded, you see it's basically quadrupled in 30 years. And there's a lot of work on how this is, why this is exactly happening. So why is there, a 4-fold increase in diabetes as compared to, a much smaller increase in obesity? What is it particularly that's driving that? But, for anyone who knows someone who has type 2 diabetes, you know that this has some really obvious implications for productivity. Whether it's energy or neuropathy or immune system, there are a huge number of issues here that can affect productivity. We also know, particularly because of the recent debate on the attempts to repeal the ACA, is that healthcare premiums have been going up rapidly for a long, long time. And in the United States, which is pretty unique in the world, these costs are borne by employers. And so if employers can figure out some way to improve health, then there are potential benefits in terms of reducing health costs and health pools. So these are just some of the reasons why this is particularly important. One of the things I want to emphasize as well is, even if you aren't thinking about what's technically called physical health, one thing that's commonly ignored in firms and also commonly ignored historically by doctors has been mental health issues. And there's a big debate sort of in the medical literature about, is there really such a thing as mental health? So a lot of psychiatrists would argue that mental health is a type of physical health. that there are biological underlying factors that drive mental health issues. And part of the problem with this, as opposed to, say, type 2 diabetes or obesity, is people tend to hide it. They can hide it, they often don't get treatment, there's shame associated with it, and it has big, big cost impacts across sort of a much broader spectrum of the population. I was talking to a big consulting company about this, and they don't have huge sort of technically physical health problems, but they realize that one of the biggest problems that they have are things around stress and burnout. And it's really hard to measure what this implication is. So this is why when you look at the evolution of health programs, it's not just about how do you get your cholesterol down, but how do you try to get stress and anxiety levels down. What happens if everybody does an hour of yoga every day? Which sounds funny to a lot of old guard managers, but there are a lot of reasons to think that these might actually have big impacts on people's health. The major issue here is that 90% of all firms have some sort of wellness program, and these vary quite substantially across companies. They have different aspects, they spend different amounts on it. There are some programs that are very effective, some that aren't very effective. But one of the things, and here's our old friend, the Wall Street Journal again, which is that one of the key things here is that most employers they don't really know what the bottom line is on this. They don't really understand what are we getting out of these type of programs. What they do know is they know that there are some things that are easier to measure that they can understand, and this is typically why managers are able to justify wellness programs, is because there are some immediate and sort of obvious payoffs here. So one is obviously absenteeism. So it's a pretty easy thing to measure. You don't have to take blood, you just see whether or not people show up. Most HR systems have these data built in. And the other thing, of course, is health insurance costs. So one way that you often sell this to a board when you're trying to implement it is you say, look, our insurance provider has agreed to give us a X% decrease in premiums. And we know from some pretty extensive meta-analyses in economics that there are actually really good returns on these things. But what we don't know, and this is something that we argue is also of primary importance, is this issue around whether or not it also affects productivity. So when you actually have people show up on the job, like say me, who are not feeling well, what does this actually do to their productivity on the job? Because you don't see that in absenteeism, particularly in a country where there are no requirements around paid sick leave. So you have a lot of workers who don't have paid sick leave, so they come to work even when they're sick. There are a lot of reasons to believe that this is important. Now, people have looked at this, but the big limitation has always been that people have studied it using self-report data. So they ask people how healthy they are, they ask them how productive they are. Well, I can tell you exactly what my answer would be if Dean Taylor asked me how productive I am. Which is awesome, right? I mean, I'm super productive. We have all those sort of biases. There are huge self-report biases on these types of dimensions. And so we think that particularly this is an important setting where there's value in actually objectively measuring, do people's health improve? Or does people's health improve? And second of all, whether or not that translates into an objective measure of productivity. And I'll show you sort of how we're going to do that in this setting. So again, the surveys, if you believe survey-based estimates on this, there are estimates like presenteeism, which is the technical term, and I'm not sure how they came up with that term, is estimated, $100, $200 billion a year. So certainly there's a belief that this is in a major, major order of magnitude range. We just don't know precisely at the firm level what exactly that return is. And so this is going to be our focus in this study. So what we're doing is we're basically asking, not just does, but really when does wellness program increase worker productivity using objective data? And again, it's going to be limited based on sort of the setting for the study, but it certainly is it's the first paper that anyone's ever done that's linked objective health data to objective productivity data. So this is our setting. So we're basically exploiting what we call a quasi experiment, and I'll explain that here in a sec, in a local industrial laundry plant. Now this is anonymous in written materials, but we're lucky to have our friends from Clean Uniform here in the back row have been really generous in working with me and my co-authors on this and on other papers. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the unique characteristics of that company that makes it feasible to do this. But basically, this is a company that does a lot of industrial laundry work for a broad range of industries, healthcare, food service. These are big industrial laundry plants, so this is not your corner laundry. Basically, they have a number of facilities across 3 or 4 states. And so what's nice about this is it's going to allow us to do something we call a Quasi Experiment, which is, in an ideal world, what you would do is you would have a randomized control trial. So if you talk to our friends from the medical school, what they would tell you is they say, in an ideal world, what you would do is you would randomly assign some employees to get the wellness program and some not to get it, and then you would just simply observe what happens. And that would be an estimate of the treatment effect. But that's a very, very difficult thing to do, particularly when it involves health issues and big expenses. What's nice about this is we're going to be able to use a quasi-experimental setup, which is that is most of the plants in this company got a wellness program implemented and one didn't. And it didn't get it implemented not for a strategic reason, but simply because that plant actually has a different contract, has a union contract. That meant they couldn't implement that. And so what that allows us to see is suddenly this policy gets implemented. It can't get implemented in one place. That gives us, what we think of as a control group. It gives us some treatment plans where we can observe people getting this treatment. And then it allows us to sort of back out a rough estimate. And I should emphasize that their workers don't have dots for heads. Okay, that joke. So basically the way this worked was in 2010, an outside firm administered health exams and surveys at 4 plants. So one thing that many of you probably know is that HIPAA regulations are very tight on these types of issues, which is a company like Clean can't gather health information on their employees, and there are lots of reasons to think why that would be a really bad thing. So what you do typically is you get some outside company to come in, and that company gathers basically health data and engages in health exams, and then the productivity data comes from the actual company. So this gets implemented at 4 plants, and basically what happens is visit 1, basically they come in and they administer this health exam. This includes sort of survey questions, but also blood draws, a lot of medical testing, BMI, things like that. And this is an important issue too. This is a voluntary program. So no one's being forced to participate. In fact, we do have about 15% of the people who choose not to participate, and I'll talk about that later. But 85% of the people do. And they get a very, very small insurance premium decrease because of this. And one of the things that I'll discuss later is that the reason that this decrease ends up being small is because their premiums are really small anyway. So they provide very, very good health insurance for their workers, which is one of the critical aspects for making these things work. So they come in and they basically examine 85% of the participants in that first period. And then what happens is if they catch anything that's a major immediate problem. So imagine that they do this and someone realizes that this person is likely to have a heart attack in the next week if they don't get treated. Or they find something and they have like stage 4 cancer. And what they do then is the nurse will reach out to that person immediately. But otherwise what happens is they're basically 3 weeks later going to come back and provide personalized packets, show health results, some counseling and education, basically tell these people, here's what your health profile looks like. So here's what we've discovered about you, and of course this is all private, so it's not going to be shared with the company. And then people can choose whether or not to take action on that as well. Some of the people are what we think of as healthy. Now you can measure this in a lot of different ways. So obviously you can measure it based on blood results. You can measure it based on doctor diagnoses. I'll talk about how we do that here. But basically what happens is we believe that if somebody is not healthy, then they have the option to go to the doctor. So they obviously don't have to do that, but they have the option to go to the doctor. And again, it's important to note here that this company has very good health insurance, which allows them to basically afford that. And then finally what happens is we can then observe over the next year whether or not their productivity changes, whether or not their performance changes, because this company has a very good IT system that tracks individual daily productivity, which is adjusted based on the difficulty of the task. And this gives them a huge ability to basically track daily what that productivity change is. And then what happens is, effectively, let me go back here, is a year later they come in, and if the worker is still working there, then they'll get a second health exam. And what that allows us to observe is whether or not the person got better. So we can actually compare like a cholesterol change over the course of a year. We can compare their BMI. So that gives us some sense of, did their productivity change across time? Did their health change across time? And how does this compare with what we call the counterfactual, which is what's going on in the control plan? And I'll talk about sort of what this identification requires. So what we use is what's technically called a difference in difference model. So again, ideally you would have a randomized control trial with a control and treatment group. But what you do in a difference in difference model is you effectively say you have one treatment group, so in this case it's the blue group, you have one control group, so this is the 5th plant, and basically the assumption is they're moving in the same trend. So they don't have to be identical, although the technology is very similar. But they have to be, their productivity, growth rate, or change rate has to be approximately the same. And then what you do is you look at after the intervention, which is right here, whether or not the change in the treatment group is different from the change in the control group. And that's the difference in differences. You look at the difference between this difference and this difference. And so this is the approach that we take. Now, it's important to note these things have, these types of methodologies are fraught with problems, so you have to be very careful. That's why we have lots of, painful tables you don't want to look at in there. But this is basically the way that we try to identify this. So again, the way that this works is they receive a small premium reduction. The program basically costs the company somewhere around $100 with a very wide range, because we don't want to tell you exactly how much. But basically, this is a decent amount of money. And then basically what happens is we get 55 production employees who participate multiple times. Now, we can only measure this effect for people who stay over the course of 2 annual exams. And this is an industry where there's a high turnover. So actually, I think one could easily argue that the turnover at Clean is lower than it is in other companies in this industry, partly because they pay better wages and have better benefits, and the workers actually like their managers. But what happens then is we essentially look at the first time that people participate. So they come in, if they're there the first year that this happens in 2010, we look at their change in health over the course of the year. We look at their change in productivity over the course of the year. If they come in 2011, we look at it from 2011 to 2012. Obviously, we can only use the first year of data, because if we use the second year of data, they'd already gotten treated once. So you obviously would think that they wouldn't improve as much. It's important to note that in this industry, as in many manual labor industries, there are very, very high base rates of health problems. So for example, if you look at abnormal blood findings, approximately 4.8 is the average for people. Now, some of this is just error. So I wouldn't say like everybody's got 4.8 problems. But on average, people are outside normal ranges on 4.8 different things out of approximately 20. 2/3 of the workers had identifiable health problems to doctors. So what we did is we hired 3 doctors to come in and evaluate every single case. And these are all anonymized data, obviously, and basically come to an agreement on whether or not this person's sick. Because obviously you don't want me evaluating that. So we looked at that. It's important to note that of the people who were in this program, 28% of people improved their health over the course of a year. Now remember, the base rate here is not 0. As people age, they get worse. And so what you might think is that people's health is degrading. It depends, but in this population you can imagine 5, maybe 10% per year. And so the base rate, the counterfactual, is actually negative. So this is a pretty substantial improvement in health. And again, we're using doctors to evaluate, did this person get better? And so basically what happens is we also have this issue around turnover, which is almost half of the people leave in the course of the year. So some of the people, obviously, we can't observe whether or not they got better. And that does limit some of our conclusions in the sense that we don't know what's different about those folks. But one of the things that's happened with this paper is as we've revised it and it's gotten better, our ROI, we've gotten much more conservative on this. And part of it is we've realized that turnover reduces the ROI pretty substantially, because obviously you don't want to spend a bunch of money on your employees' health and then have them leave and go work for someone else. So really what we think is the benefits here are coming to the people who stay. Now again, one of the nice things is that this company has a substantially lower turnover rate than the industry average. It's just that this is the nature of a lot of these types of jobs, is turnover. So what do we think might happen? Why do we think productivity might improve? And this is really what we call speculating. But here's sort of the way we think about this. There's sort of 2 dimensions here on employees that we think about. On the vertical axis, we have sort of whether or not we think they're sick. Are they sick or are they healthy? Do they have an existing problem? And on the horizontal axis, what we think is that we ask whether or not they get improved. And so what you might think is even if somebody is healthy and they don't improve, that they still might be a little more productive because they're like, hey, this is really nice, you guys did this for us, you provided this benefit, it improves our relationship with employees. And so they still might improve a little bit on this standpoint. If they actually improve, what you might also think is that they get some job satisfaction improvement, but they also perhaps get more capable. So this is something that Mahendra Gupta and I were talking about yesterday, which is this idea that even very healthy people, who are technically not sick, you don't want to ignore those people with these type of health programs. Because you may not technically qualify as being sick, but still if you have better diet, better exercise, you can have better mental health, better physical health. So we still think there might be some improvement there. For the people who are sick, what you might think is that they're going to have some job satisfaction. They might also have some gratitude for discovering something. So essentially, even if I don't get better, and even if I don't become more productive because of that, I might be very thankful to the company for actually, discovering that I have some underlying health problem, because that may have saved my life. And there are certainly, a couple comments around this that I'll show you in a sec. And then what we really think, here's where we think the biggest benefit is going to be, is you take people who have some existing health problem, you identify it to them, then they improve. And so it's not only the fact that they're thankful you identified this, that they appreciate the relationship that you have with them, but also that they simply got more capable. And remember, this is a job which is very physically demanding. And even jobs that aren't physically demanding, like say being a professor, you might still think that this would be important, particularly on mental health reasons. But this is just kind of the way that we think about sort of what we expect this. A few quotes, I won't dwell too long on this, but the employees certainly reflected that they were appreciative of this. Again, there were a few employees who decided not to participate. You would think those people are different. But certainly the employees were thankful that this was provided and that it caught and solved some problems around this. That they otherwise wouldn't. Because again, in this demographic, typically you have lower rates of people going to the doctor, you have higher base rates of illness problems. So basically what we do through the statistical analysis, we estimate an ROI of 76%. Now we note that this is a very conservative estimate. I told you it used to be much higher. We're basically taking the lower bound on all of our estimates in terms of what this change would be. But basically, again, the way to think about this is on average, the plants where this was implemented as compared to the plant where it was not, you can think of an average change that's pretty substantial and an ROI that comes out at 76%. So basically...
Mark, could you describe productivity?
Yeah. Sure, so productivity measure in this case, basically the way you should think about it is people are using large dryers, they're rolling mats, they're folding, they're doing repairs. And so what the company does to measure productivity is they have everybody, and again, this is because they have a good IT system, they have everybody, they know at any given moment what job they're doing, they know how many units are going through, so think now RFID technology. So they know in 25 minutes, this person sewed 27 shirts, and this is based off of what you think of as a time study base rate. So you know sort of what the average amount of this is. And so basically what the comparison on productivity is, given the combination of tasks that these different workers are engaged in during the day, what would we expect the average worker to complete? How much did they? And that essentially gives you an efficiency rating. Now anybody who's done time studies here knows that there are always challenges with that. As long as those are uniform across our population, then the results are valid. But we do know that our time studies are a little bit noisy. But basically what we see is the sick employees who improve get about a 10% increase. So if we see somebody's health improve, we see them then have about 10% increase in productivity relative to the control group. We see 11% for the healthy employees, those who are technically not sick, but whose baseline evaluations get better. And then we see a small decrease for the people who are non-compliers or choose not to participate. There's no way for us to be able to understand why non-compliers or non-participants went down. It could be because they're fundamentally different. It could be that they're fundamentally skeptical. You're always going to have some percentage of this. So obviously if you had a 80% non-compliance rate, then the ROI on this would change pretty dramatically. But certainly their productivity is dropping, and we can't observe what's going on with their health. So these are sort of the baseline results. You can see that I got a bad grade in art, but I tried to create this 3D graph that kind of gives you a sense of what this looks like. So basically the vertical axis here is the productivity growth. Basically, as you move here from the origin out this way, people are sicker. As you move out this way, they're getting better. What you can see is, perhaps not surprising from our estimates, people who are getting better are having the biggest productivity jump. Part of the reason why this looks negative, and I'll talk about this in a sec, is we have a relatively small sample. So we actually don't have anybody out here. We don't have anybody out there who's super sick and then gets super better, and that should not be surprising. But in general, what this suggests is, the strongest finding is that simply getting better, whether you're sick or healthy, improves your productivity by about 10% compared to what everybody else is doing. If you want to look at specific health improvements, this is one of the nice things we have. So we're slicing this really thin here, so we don't have a lot of employees. So the number of people, whose kidney function improves, electrolyte function improves, cholesterol, diabetes, enzyme improve is small, which is why those confidence intervals are pretty wide. So, we're not saying this is definitive evidence on this, but this appears to make sense. It seems like all the things that tend to be associated, particularly with obesity and diabetes, are improving productivity. If you look at the self-response lifestyle factors, so the survey asked people, what did you do? How did you change over the last year? The key things that we notice here are that people report having nutrition gains. They report doing more exercise days. They report lower stress signals, and those seem to be associated with productivity gains. Now, one reason that I put HDL up here, which is a measure of cholesterol, which is important, is this is the type of cholesterol that can't be affected by medication, unless something's changed, and I didn't keep up on that. But basically, HDL cholesterol is a really good indication, not just about whether or not you're telling us that you're having a better diet and more exercise, but whether you're actually doing it. And HDL, it's important to note, HDL here is the strongest indicator for us of people's improvement, which is entirely consistent with people basically taking better care of themselves. So one of the things that I want to note about this study is really what you need at this point is a randomized control group. So this is a very small sample. So again, like when you're basically status quo in research is 0, then even a small sample that's not a true randomized control group is really informative. So you can ask medical professors who do research, obviously you'd rather have data on 20 people in terms of the efficacy of an oncology drug than have it on 0 if you basically have 0. So this is sort of the first study. We have a pretty small sample here. So we've got 111 workers. That does not get us what we would call true statistical power to identify most effects really precisely. And what we did is we basically did a broad simulation exercise, which was facilitated by the fact that our dean's office is incredibly supportive with big computers. But what we essentially did is we asked the question, if there were a true effect of different sizes, how often would we actually be able to detect it? So the question here is around false positives. So the question is if the true effect here is, and this is really sort of the effect size, so if the true effect here is going to be, what we estimated, which is about a 6 to 8% improvement, how many workers would you actually need to be confident that you could identify the productivity change? And the answer to this is not 111. So this is our study. So this power basically that we have here is somewhere between 0.3 to 0.6. Now, if you talk to a psychologist, they basically throw their hands up in the air. We talk to an MD, they basically say, look, this is a problem. You're going to miss a lot of false positives. It doesn't invalidate, or a lot of false negatives. It doesn't invalidate our results, but what this suggests is that the next step in this type of research is to find a company that effectively has 800 or 1,000 employees that you could randomly assign some locations to a control group or to a treatment group. So for example, I've got an RCT now going with a big auto company where we've taken 1,000 dealerships and we've randomly assigned some of them to one condition and some to another. That gets you a lot of power, but you need that type of setup to really be able to precisely estimate a lot of these effects. Okay, what are the implications? So what factors are crucial for the ROI here? So again, this is a study of one firm, and I want to be really clear about why we think that there's a positive ROI on this study at this firm. So one of the first things here is that it's important to note that turnover is crucial for making these things pay off. So one of the reasons the ROI is not higher here is because of the high turnover rate. If you have much lower turnover rates, then these things pay off over longer periods of time. The last thing you want to do again is invest heavily and then have basically people leave and go off and get somebody else to get these benefits. So you need to be able to control turnover. If you can reduce turnover, you get much bigger payoffs on these types of programs. Second of all, it's crucial that basically you provide some schedule flexibility and insurance support to employees. If you do this and you don't give them paid sick leave, and you don't give them good insurance or any insurance at all, then obviously they're not going to be able to take action on this. It's going to be very difficult to do this. So these HR policies are very complementary. So again, like Clean has very, very solid and good supportive HR policies that make this work. And again, like this is a really nice reason for why treating your employees well actually allows you to get some big payoff from something that it might not otherwise. So this is an important factor. Third, employees have to trust you. So, this is something we all sort of intuitively know, but often ignore. If they don't trust their managers, they're going to be really suspicious of you coming in and giving them blood tests. So again, one of the characteristics of Clean Uniform is this historical good relationship with their employees. They pay them well, they provide them good support, they treat them well, they get better productivity out of them. And one thing that I constantly harp on is that people focus too much on wages when they think of the ROI on labor and labor costs, and not enough on productivity. And so if if they don't trust you, they're not going to participate in these programs. They're going to view them as some way of you to intrude on their privacy. And finally, they really have to believe that this isn't coercive. So if they feel like they're being forced into doing this, it threatens their autonomy, particularly in a very personal matter like health. Then this can become pretty problematic. And so if you were to look at all the wellness programs that are out there, you could find a number of these things that simply aren't going to work, and they aren't going to work, because when you roll out the nurses who are taking blood draws from their employees, the employees are going to be like, screw you, I'm not giving you my blood, even though it's legal. Even though it's illegal for the company to actually have that, employees might justifiably not trust it. And certainly, this is an American company, but certainly if you expand this to the biggest and fastest growing economies in the world, if you think like China, or you think India, you have very, very different rules and regulations around this. So there are a lot of implications for why you need to maintain this long-term relationship and trust with your employees. One thing I'd like to end with here is that I often hear people focus heavily on this idea of, does corporate social responsibility pay off for companies? You'll often hear this discussed, whether it's from scholars or pundits or companies, whatever it is, they ask this question. This is completely the wrong question. The right question is not whether or not it pays off, but really what are the aspects that do and when. So what we really care about, is thinking about this as much more surgical policies, which is, look, it's not like if we hug all of our employees and, make the environment a better place, that this is always going to pay off for the bottom line. If we as policymakers, even if we want that to happen, if we as policymakers believe that, this is what we need to do, we're going to be sorely disappointed. And that's why if you look at, very conservative people at think tanks like Heritage Foundation, or and you look at people from the far left like Robert Reich, who's the former labor secretary, Professor Berkeley, they say exactly the same thing, which is the last thing you want to do is kid yourself. You can tell employees, that you can basically tell everybody to do the right thing and the companies will do it, and then it will make the world a better place. What we need to ask the questions around is, where are there policies that both are better for society and companies and better for employees? And this is one example of that. And this is one of the reasons we like this a lot. I think one of the things that we're ignoring and not talking about enough in the debate over the ACA is that we're missing a tremendous number of payoffs from an economic growth standpoint in terms of people just simply being healthier and productivity. So we really want to emphasize that as managers, we think about which specific policies are going to be most helpful and when are they going to be able to be implemented profitably. Thank you very much. I'm now open to a large number of questions. Yes.
So great job. You do not look sick at all. Like, you were dynamic. You did a wonderful job. So in this particular instance, if you look at all of the costs
Yep.
of this wellness program and you look at the benefit, the number you threw out was like 76%.
Yeah, that's what the ROI got.
And so you had those four different, like the four different groups. The group that didn't take care of themselves had a decrease, the others had single digit, one had a double digit increase. Could you actually give a percentage, like if you spend X, then you're going to get 2.4X, or can you give a ratio based on this particular study?
Yeah, that's one of the tricky things about this type of setting. So what we're estimating is basically a marginal effect or a change based on the actual policy that was implemented. In an ideal world, if you had 10,000 employees, so imagine that you had, say, 200 restaurants or 500 restaurants or 1,000 restaurants, and you implemented this. What you'd love to be able to do is try different intervention levels and find out what sort of the optimal ROI is, because inevitably, in terms of health interventions, and I think this is the point you're getting at, it's an inverse U-shape, right? Obviously, you don't want to spend like $90,000 a year on trying to get your employees to exercise more. And you probably don't want to spend, $1. So what we're able to observe here is one treatment and sort of one policy. And we can say that if you're kind of in this range and you have sort of characteristics that are similar to this company, here's what we think the ROI is. Now, what we can sort of back out from this is how things like changes in turnover would affect this. So if you cut turnover by half, then the ROI basically skyrockets. So that's sort of the one we think as a comparative static you can do. But yeah, I mean, it's always really hard to sort of estimate the treatment effect far away from what you actually observe. But again, like that's why you'd love to have multiple treatments and say, what happens if we do this program? What happens if we do this program? Or you can compare a bunch of firms that did it in different ways and try to back out from that. But again, like it's really hard to find companies that are willing to let you study this. So yes.
In addition to the biometric screening that was done at Clean, the control group, were there other initiatives, wellness initiatives that were happening, or was that simply the intervention was the biometric and nothing in between?
Yeah, so I mean, this is sort of always one of the tricky things of measuring interventions in a non-experimental setting is that you do get some other policies that are being implemented. The only thing here that we would be at all concerned about is sort of other interventions around wellness that would differentially affect one plant rather than the other. And this is your guys' opportunity to tell me if I'm wrong. But we're not aware of anything that selectively happened at this point that was different in the treatment plants than the control plants. But again, like the effect here is contextual on what was going on. But yeah, you would always be concerned that something in parallel is happening. They're implementing lots of different things. Yeah, no, it's a good point. Yes?
It's related to the earlier question. So if you look into the future, crystal ball,
Yeah.
and they keep doing this for 10 years, do you think their return on investment would increase, decrease from the 76%? And I suppose it's a function of the turnover as well, but, I can argue it going increasing and decreasing, but any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a debate that maybe they and other companies have had is, do you do this once or twice, or do you keep doing it? And part of this is kind of about how you believe, how permanent you believe a one-time intervention can be on people's behavior. I was giving a talk at ESA in Barcelona, and it's basically run by Opus Dei, by a Catholic organization. So there were a bunch of priests in the audience, and I used this analogy. I said, look, this is kind of like the question of, if somebody goes to church on Easter once a year, does that change behavior? Do they need to keep going every single week and sort of have that reinforcement? And my gut on this, although we can't really say this, is you'd probably want to have a strong first-time intervention, but what you then focus on moving forward is not necessarily all the costly blood tests, but really, just kind of refocusing them and making sure that they get some reminder about how important wellness is. And I think the company, certainly, when we talked, had that type of emphasis and that culture. But yeah, I mean, that's another sort of question.
Yeah, we kind of, we give a little bit less, we kind of go a little bit less detail now. It was almost too much. We have it's actually moved to a different program, but it's very, actually, kind of how he's describing it. But I think the one big thing that you think about is if you have one heart attack or if you have one big episode, that can wipe your whole healthcare cost for the year. So if you get one person that goes to the doctor and gets on blood pressure medicine, that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings for us. So I mean, it's amazing how one cancer case will, wipe out that one particular company's entire healthcare budget.
And that's a particularly important issue here in our study because of the small n. So we don't, like, if we had 10,000 employees in this type of study, we could observe those catastrophic health events. To the best of our knowledge, we didn't observe any catastrophic health events during this period. So probably if you think that those things would be coming down the line, then probably this is understating it. I mean, one thing that humans do with great skill is they undervalue the expected cost of low probability, major events. I mean, we see this with the hurricanes that have happened this year. We underinsure for these catastrophic rare events. And in a small sample like this, we don't observe any. But there was probably one coming down the line. And certainly, I know here in this, in this place, we've had, our share because we have a lot larger employee pool of catastrophic health events that no doubt cost a huge amount to the organization. Yeah, Nick?
Are you looking for collaborators with large databases?
So I'll tell you, like, what I'm really looking for on this, this is great, it's so helpful. I mean, the next step on this, frankly, is like I said, to run a big randomized control trial. Would be to find a company, like I mentioned, the auto manufacturer, who's willing to say, look, we
Like
want
an Emerson or somebody?
Yeah, so Emerson actually is a great.
Where's the Emerson lady?
So what you need is you need two characteristics. So one, you need characteristics where you have lots of locations. Because if you run it in one location, and I basically take all of you and say you're all here, let's take all the faculty here at WashU, you're going to get a bunch of contamination, which is, if I get one treatment and Anne-Marie gets another, we're likely to talk about this. There's going to be some spillover effect. So an ideal situation, what you do is have like what we have here. So you have some locations that get it, some that don't, and have people who don't talk much to one another. That would be the ideal setting. And so, this is why I use car dealerships, and I'm running a bunch of RCTs with car dealerships now. We can basically do treatments at the basically metropolitan area. So, Dayton gets one treatment, and St. Louis gets another. And, there's no competition between them. There's probably not going to be a lot of talk across them. It's those type of settings that are going to be really, really helpful. And frankly, that type of study would give, a much more accurate and nuanced result on what this happens, sort of what the return on this is. Yes, Dr. Locke.
So I had a turnover question. So did it affect turnover, one, and two, who leaves? Is it the sick people or the healthy people?
Yeah, so one thing that we can't say anything about is we can't say anything about turnover, partly because, I put this up on the slide, the control group is a union plant, and so they have very, very low turnover per se. Again, that isn't the identifying assumption, so that doesn't affect our results on productivity. But turnover is just very, very, very different in the union plant versus the other plants. You have much sort of people staying much, much longer. And so we can't really say anything about that. Regarding your second one, I should know the answer to that. Off the top of my head, I don't. But yeah, no, I should go back and look at that. It's a really interesting question. Yes, Ted?
Have you looked at this with a high innovation quotient firm? Are there any studies? In other words, a tech company with a workforce between 20 and 40 years of age, and see if training them like a college athlete would improve their mental capacity?
Yeah, no, I haven't. And again, part of the issue there is getting somebody to do that, but also having good sort of measures on productivity. I certainly know from discussions with consulting companies that they think about this a lot, but their primary focus is around mental health. That's primarily what they're thinking about because they just have severe problems. So you take like a McKinsey, right? They have severe problems with burnout, law companies, science companies. Very intense pressure, and so you're likely to suffer a lot more, and this is harder to measure, or the health thing. So I have a paper that we're about to release using the Danish data set, which is kind of infamous in the world. So the Danes collect everything about their people, which is really nice. So we have everybody's prescription drug history, we have everybody's jobs, we have their income. And so one of the things that we've just done is we've looked at what happens when a company implements pay-for-performance systems at the company. do you see a requisite change in mental health issues? And again, we can do that because we've got 1.5 million Danes in the data set. We can see these changes. Certainly what we observe there, and this is among high earners, is we observe that when companies implement these pay-for-performance systems, which tend to be much higher stress, even though they pay more, they have higher stress, you see about a 10% increase in benzodiazepine usage and SSRIs. Now what you also see is you see some people with underlying mental health issues selecting out of the company, because Denmark has very high labor mobility because it's got single-payer health insurance and good unemployment support. But what we think is that problem is probably even much, much bigger, say in a place like the United States, where people are frightened if they have an underlying health problem to leave their job because they might not be able to get insurance again. So that's the only evidence we have on that. But again, that's a very, very rough estimate. We can't see individual productivity. But what we can see is, when a company implements a pay-for-performance system, that you see particularly high increases in these drug usage among older workers, higher income workers, and the entire effect comes from men. Which is interesting because a lot of people argue that women tend to have lower preferences or tend to dislike pay for performance. There are other people who argue that women are more robust to changes in stress. But certainly what we see is all of this effect is being loaded up on men over 50. Even though women have a higher base rate of SSRIs and benzos, the change happens all in the older men. And you can imagine, for people who are nearing the end of their career, it might be hard for them to change. So that's sort of what we know. Yes?
So coming back to turnover, other than controlling in a statistical analysis, is there no way you think to treat that variable?
So what we can do is we can certainly leave all else equal in our ROI analysis and take some hypotheticals. So we could say if say half of the people who left within a year didn't leave, and if we assume that that population is equivalent to the people who stayed, which is who we're estimating the treatment effect off of, then we can sort of back out, back of the envelope calculation, what those changes would be. And our initial ROI calculation on this paper was 250%. That was before a reviewer thankfully pointed out that we were ignoring turnover, which is why we go through these brutal processes. But certainly you can back that out. The problem is, and this gets to Anne-Marie's comment, I'm skeptical that the people who turn over quickly within a year are the same as the people who stay. And I think, if you talk to the Lazaroffs, they would concur with that. It's a different population set, they have different demographics, and more importantly for estimating this, they have different unobservables, in terms of whether or not they'd be motivated to change it. So all I can say is it would definitely go up. I don't know how much, but certainly it does point out that turnover is a pretty important issue. And also hiring people who are likely to stay for a while. Yes?
What were the demographics for this particular group? Are they mostly college educated? I mean, what's kind of the...
No, so these are, think of this as sort of industrial factory workers, so blue collar jobs. The productivity measures are requisite on somebody basically working a factory floor job.
Yeah.
So, think low education levels, a higher proportional, say, minority level, although that depends on which location. One of the nice things is that these plants are located across, I think of it as sort of a tri-state region. And so, in some places, like, for instance, if you're in O'Fallon, you're going to have a lot more, say, white workers, and in St. Louis City, you'll have more African Americans. But yeah, I think relatively lower education levels. So if you looked at these demographics, what you would note is that these are exactly the people who tend to have really high base rates of things like obesity and diabetes. They will tend to not go to the doctor as often, even if you give them good health insurance. And they will tend to have less education on these types of interventions.
I'll say that was actually the biggest thing that we got. Well, first of all, since then the union plant is involved in we've gotten them into the program.
Good.
But one of the biggest anecdotes we got was you walk around and said, I never had a blood draw before. So this is that type of population where they have a free health check every year in their program that they weren't even using. So this is actually just administering, that part of that visit. And so you have folks say, oh man, then I sent my son And I sent so other people that were dependents were also going and getting, getting checked for some real basic stuff that all they needed was maybe some slight medication, some slight awareness. So yeah, this was the first blood draw for a lot of folks. That was a big.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Again, I'm interested in any wellness initiatives in between the biometrics. Was there anything you're doing?
Stuff that was stuff that the wellness firm, there's smoking cessation programs that they all had access to. Some of them, there was walking, each group did like a walking group that year, the HR manager at each location, but they all were doing this especially because we knew we were studying this stuff, a lot of them were doing the same, they were all doing the same, access to the same programs. Whether the culture at each place is a little different, so that would be the only thing, did we stop bringing in fried chicken every month, because we're doing this program? Yeah, a lot of people did that, but I don't know how often we stopped bringing in fried chicken.
Yeah, certainly there's, the whole literature on behavioral economics and nudging, on health issues suggests that even the barrier of having to find a doctor and having to go and get a blood draw can be overwhelming. And so, one of the big things here is you bring nurses in to actually draw the blood there. And, it seems like a small issue, but it's an overwhelming. Every time I move to a new place, it's always been like 2 years before I find a new dentist just because it's overwhelming. So I think that's an important thing. And it also suggests that the social welfare spillovers from this program, even beyond what the company earns, are much, much larger, particularly if it applies to people's kids and their diets as well. Yeah.
You touched on mental health a little bit.
Yes.
And when you showed some of the comments of the employees that went through the program, it seemed like that was having a positive impact. Could one infer that if that were true, that potentially turnover rates could come lower because they're happier employees that want to switch?
Yeah, that's certainly kind of in the set of mechanisms that we think are important here. Is just like job satisfaction and I think the mental health issues are huge. I think they're enormous. They're really hard to measure, and I think because they're hard to measure, we tend to undervalue them, as managers. One of the basics of human behavior is we tend to focus on the stuff that we can observe and measure easily, and that's natural. So I'm sure you're right, and I'm sure that if you can get that, what you need to do in order to make that happen is you have to remove the stigma around mental health issues, and there's still tremendous stigma around this, even in universities around mental health issues and whether or not they're valid illness or whether there's something wrong with you. But yeah, I think it's a huge issue and people don't talk about it. Yes?
So our administrative and our management position, we experience really low turnover, but our frontline workers is really high turnover. So in this study, was this all frontline workers or was management or administration involved at all?
Yeah, so management or administration was involved in the wellness program. We just can't measure their productivity. So now he's going to start interrupting me. But certainly among the top management, it's excellent, I'm sure.
That's one question. So
Yeah.
I noticed you did say there's a 6% decrease in productivity of non-compliant.
Yeah.
And if I'm interpreting that correctly, that's those are people who were at plants that did participate,
Yes,
chose
that's
not
right.
to participate.
Yep.
So, one question is, was that statistically significant? And the question is that a case for auto-enrollment?
Yeah, so that's there's certainly a lot of people who believe that basically changing. I don't think so. Basically changing defaults, and this is what behavioral economists focus a lot on defaults. Like you think about what's the default savings rate for your 401k, what's the default enrollment. My personal sense on this is I think that decrease is impossible to interpret because the people who are going to opt out are going to tend to be the ones who are more suspicious of the company, who maybe they have something they want to hide. So one of the things we're concerned about is they might be opting out because they're afraid of a drug issue showing up. But certainly, if you asked behavioral economists on this topic or on savings, they would say the default effects are very, very important. And what I mean by default effects is that people opt out of something like retirement. In fact, our university has now implemented this on retirement savings. Is now you have to opt out of saving for your 403b rather than opting in. with the belief that this is going to change behavior. And, as I mentioned about dentists, I believe that's the case, but I just don't know, and it's a pretty small set, so.
Okay, I think we should probably conclude, so we've got to finish on time. We should say that Lamar is highly productive. She's a fantastic educator and presenter, but also an absolutely top-rate researcher and a rising star in the profession. And also is a great administrator. It's been a great help for us in developing and cementing our relationship with the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. So, all round, congratulations and thank you for that great presentation. A good example of the kind of research that we aim to do and produce here at Open. And if you're interested in developing a relationship with perhaps Emerson or anybody else wants to get involved further, please have a word with Dorothy Kitno, our corporate relations person here, or any of Dorothy's staff. And copies of the paper are available at the registration desk, or we can certainly email one to you. So, thanks very much. I'm off to find myself a doctor and a dentist.